share my screen and we'll get started. We've got plenty of people in the room. All right, Mary, I'm just going to introduce you and Reno and then let you guys take over because this is really your show and we're just here to learn from you today. So in the room, we've got literacy directors, USBE folks, and then online there are other similar roles participating via distance today. So Mary and Reno are both from West Ed and they're going to kind of walk us through how to conduct focus groups, what to be mindful of so that even if you're not going to conduct one right now, you at least have the knowledge and skills to do so in the future. And then this is particularly within reference to the framework that we've been working on, going out. And the survey data, as of this morning, we had 1,500 teachers that have responded. So it's a good kind of result so far. We're hoping for another 1,000 or more in the next couple of weeks. But thank you to all of you that already got it out. We had some good response. Your principals in Salt Lake were super responsive.
Well, I sent it out distribution, so
yeah.
even the plumbers.
Everybody got it. So
like, no, that's not for you. Sorry,
right.
sorry.
Just ignore it. Yeah. So if you haven't sent it out, please do so. It's going to give us some, just from the initial 1,500 teachers, and I think we have almost a couple hundred principals and folks in there. 150 coaches, I think, have responded at this point. Yeah. It'll give us some good data to kind of work from. So please encourage people to do that still. Elementary is the focus, though. I did have some secondary people going, it doesn't look like it's for us. I'm like, yep, it's not. We'll do secondary another day. So Mary, I'm going to hand things off and just blow this up so you can see it. I'm probably going to have to control it, so just boss me around on changing this. Actually, I might be able to give you access. Let me try.
That I can do. That would be great.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'd like to introduce Reno Makinen. I think you can see, I hope you can see his face, and he's waving at you now. So Reno is a colleague of mine at West Ed. He works on the Regional Education Laboratory as well as on the West Comprehensive Center. And Reno is more on the research side of things. I'm more on the program side of things. But I understand, Jennifer, that you have mainly district literacy directors in the room. Is that correct? And then some USBE folks?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, great. So before we begin, I don't know if you have copies of the PowerPoint, but if you do, and we'll get to those eventually, but on slide 24, there are two references that we relied heavily on as we put together this PowerPoint for you today. Also, I'm wondering if everybody has the handouts, Jennifer.
I emailed all of it out.
Okay, great. So you should have the literacy focus group script and then the facilitation tips, and we'll refer to those as we go on. Next slide.
1 second, I'm just logging us in on displaying. I forgot you. They can't see you yet. There we go. And okay, I think you're good. And Reno, you should have presenter right, so you may be able to click. Not possible. Okay. We'll find out.
Okay, so
I can drive, no problem.
All right.
Are you going to drive it right now? Are you driving?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to pass it. I know I have control now, so I can drive.
Okay, that's fine. You go ahead and keep it. That's fine. So our topics for today are on the screen. So we'll provide a little overview of what focus groups are and are not, and how you might want to use them. We will talk a little bit about how to plan for a focus group. We'll go over a focus group script that we've developed particularly on the literacy project that you all are involved in. And it obviously could be adapted for other purposes as well. We'll talk a little bit about how to facilitate the focus group and include some troubleshooting tips. And then we'll try to make room for questions and answers. But I'd like to encourage you to ask questions and answers as we go along. We're a fairly small group, and you can use the chat box. For those of you who have your own laptops in front of you, there's a chat box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And if you'd like to ask questions using that, that's fine too. So before we get into all of the definitions and the hows and whys, I'd like you to think a little bit on the next slide about, can you move it right now? There we go. Think about a focus group experience that you've had. What aspect of the focus group made it positive for you? And then it doesn't look like everybody, or maybe everybody does have a laptop. Summarize that positive feature of your focus group experience in the chat box. So we'll give you a few minutes to think about a positive focus group experience and then summarize what made it positive in the chat box.
I can say what you guys said. You want that in here?
Yeah, there aren't any right or wrong answers, so don't be shy. Just what
I'm just adding in people who aren't on the computer if they were talking. So I'm like, I'll add yours.
Okay.
You can if you want. If not, just tell me what you want and I will type it.
Organized, yet flexible enough for different viewpoints to come up.
Which is fine. I haven't used one and I don't know. Okay. I write the button.
Nor should you.
I can behind you. Oh,
But
I cannot now. But then until the other time I need it back. Maybe. I'm going long.
I can.
And then Mary, are you going to summarize some of the comments?
I sure am.
Great.
Let's take about one more minute if you have anything else to add.
Anything else you'd like me to add, friends?
So all of these things that you mentioned, we will also mention as we work through the PowerPoint today, because rephrasing is really important and that links to the listening. You're going to conduct a focus group, you have to really listen carefully to what people are saying. So you can rephrase what they're saying to make sure you understand it, and also to be flexible if need be. So another point that was brought out is the different perspectives. And yes, we'll talk about that as well today, because that really comes into the planning piece of focus groups. As you plan who you're going to invite and who should be invited, you want to make sure that you do get different perspectives and different viewpoints, because that also will make it more worthwhile for the participants if they can hear from other people and other opinions. And the other thing that was mentioned is the importance of making sure that everybody has a voice. We'll have some tips at the end of the session on how to draw out some people who may be fairly shy and don't want to offer their opinions, but it is important to hear from everybody. So sounds like you've had positive experiences, and as you take over the role of facilitator, as you yourself conduct focus groups, you want to keep these things in mind. What made it a positive experience? So let's move on. Reno is going to share with us the overview, and Reno, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to give just a couple minutes on a basic overview of the basics, and we'll get more into the details, both in planning and facilitating as we go, but this is just a big picture overview to get started. And I think we'll start with a definition, what a focus group is. We'll sort of build from that. Again, it's a small group of 6 to 10 people led through an open discussion by a skilled facilitator. The group needs to be large enough to generate a maximum number of different ideas and opinions from different people in the time allotted. And again, we want to unpack this a little bit because I think there's a couple key terms and key ideas in here that we want to break apart and we're going to talk more about today. The first thing is the skilled facilitator part. You need a facilitator who's credible, knowledgeable, and objective. I think those are the 3 big traits that you want to know that can, again, be an engaged leader in the discussion. And that engagement will allow you to generate the second key idea here, which is the maximum number of different ideas and opinions. The entire point of research in social sciences is about understanding variation. And so for this, and for in focus groups, the goal is to get a rich explanation or description of how something is playing out in different ways and understanding why that is. So you're really looking for a rich description or explanation, and you want to build those different ideas and opinions that will understand the variation of that phenomenon. And in this case, literacy, instruction, and support. So that's just the basic there, and we're going to go more into the details. What a focus group is not, as you'll see, it's not a training session. It's not, you're not promoting anything. There's no agenda. It's not group therapy. It's not a debate. So again, these are things that group discussions can often be categorized in these types of ways, if not for quality facilitation. And I think that's a key part of this. And you mentioned a bit about the survey you're conducting. That's more of the empirically representative sample of opinions in the field, like more of a census or a poll. A focus group is not that. As I mentioned, a focus group is more description and explanation. So this is sort of just to bound what we're talking about today with a little bit of definition. So again, the key role in this process is the facilitator. And that individual is someone the group can relate to and that they respect, someone who has a credibility with the group, someone who knows the subject and is knowledgeable and keeps their personal views and ego out of facilitation. This is not someone with an agenda, and that person needs to be an objective leader of the conversation. Generally, we recommend from WestCC that the person is not in a supervisory role of participants in the focus group. That would tend to sort of influence the discussion. We'd like this to be an objective, knowledgeable, credible, independent facilitator. And then as we move down to the lower bullets, it's about that engagement. It's getting everyone to offer what they can based on their experience and background, listening actively, engaged, making eye contact, tracking what's being said, being empathetic, and being able to think at the same time. You don't necessarily want to be taking detailed notes as a facilitator, but you might want to note some things about folks who are speaking maybe more often than others. You want to try and track names if you can. And we'll get back to that, some of those details. And then really the last bullet is the most important one. It's really managing the group dynamics, again, to engender a variety of perspectives around the topic of interest to really make the most use of the time that you have together. But it's not just the facilitator that we recommend as part of this. There are two people who are really responsible for this. We believe both facilitator and a note taker is very important. The note taker in the room, we recommend having a second person there. They're a person who will get the consent forms for participation, for voluntary participation in the session. A person who operates the digital recorder. I think it's very important to both record the session and transcribe it so you don't lose the raw material that you're gathering in the data, but also have a note taker to balance that in case for some reason the digital recorder malfunctions, but also to track their overall perceptions as well. And they can also add clarifying questions that the facilitator might not be able to ask as a silent observer or sort of a backup facilitator. They also want to be tracking the role group information. Do you have primarily experienced educators in the room? Are there secondary and elementary educators? What's the makeup of the room like? And tracking other subtle and relevant cues as well. So we want to make sure that folks, this is the sort of overall parameters. We're going to give you the definition of what it is, what it isn't, and then the roles of the folks in the room. And we're going to go a little bit more detail into facilitation as we get into the details, but we're going to shift a bit now into just planning the logistics once we've just given that basic overview. I think Mary's going to take on these slides.
Great. So as you go about planning a focus group, there's a lot of detail that you need to think about. And on the next slide, we have outlined a few of those things that you want to take into consideration. For one thing, you want to have focus group participants who share a common experience or interest, goal, or need. So for example, with literacy instruction, you might want to hear from teachers, literacy coaches, administrators. But you also might want to procure a range of perspectives. So for example, if you do want to interview teachers, you might want to include people from different grade spans in a single focus group so you get the different perspectives. Also, you want to have at least 3 sessions, at least 3 focus groups with each subgroup. So let's go back to the example. If you're going to have focus groups with teachers, administrators, and literacy coaches, you probably want to have at least 3 different sessions with each of those groups. And we recommend that you limit the number of participants to 6 to 10 adults. If you get much beyond that, it's hard to hear the opinions and views of everybody. And as you think about who to invite, you might want to consider inviting a few extras to each focus group session. Invariably, at least in our experience, there are last minute cancellations. And if you get too small, that's equally concerning because then you're not really getting that broad perspective that you want from a focus group session. Some more planning considerations include the schedule. And with educators, you probably would be best off scheduling it at a time when everybody has availability. So right after school, before they can actually leave school, would be a good time to schedule, or other times where there are common planning times, that sort of thing. You want to think about the location as well. So the room should easily accommodate the number of people that you've invited, and it's actually better to have a room that's too big than too small for obvious reasons. And then the room setup is another thing you want to think about in advance. If there are chairs in the room, you want to arrange the chairs in a circle. If there are tables in the room, you want to arrange the tables in a square or in an oblong so everybody can see one another. Before, about at least 1 week in advance of the focus group, you want to send out invitations. So you've decided who should be involved, you've selected your participants, and then at least 1 week before the actual date of the focus group, you want to send out the invitations. And the invitations should be very clear about the topic and purpose of the focus group, what you're hoping to learn. This is where you make the case that it's worth their time to show up. You want to be real clear about the date, time, and specific location of the focus group. Provide your name or someone else's name that they can contact with a phone number if they have questions or last minute schedule conflicts. And then right before the scheduled focus group, you want to reissue that invitation as a reminder. Additional planning considerations actually could be found in those two references that we mentioned at the beginning and are listed on 24 on slide 24. But these are the ones you want to really think about most carefully. Are there any questions that people have about things to consider in the planning? Either speak up or put it in the chat. Okay, then let's move on to the focus group script. And I believe you have the draft or the copy that we've developed for the literacy focus groups. And we'll ask you to review that more carefully here in a few minutes. But basically, the focus group script should start out with a thank you. I mean, you're asking people to donate their time. And so you want to make sure you thank them appropriately for that. The introduction should also state clearly what the purpose and context of the focus group is. And much of this is what you've already put in the invitation, but on the day of the focus group, you want to reiterate really clearly what the purpose is and why you're doing what you're doing. And you want to arrange, then you want to provide introductions. You start with yourself and the note taker, obviously. And then go around the room and ask everybody to introduce themselves. And one tip that Raina will talk about in a little bit is a tip that both he and I have used in focus groups. You want to remember people by first name. So you might want to make a little map of where people are sitting so that if people aren't participating or if they are dominating the conversation, you can actually call them by name. In the introduction too, you also want to remind them that everything that is said in the focus group should be kept confidential. This is not something that they should subsequently go out in the parking lot and discuss with all of their colleagues. It should be a safe place for people to share their opinions. And then you also want to reassure them that any report that will be written up, and there will be a report, a summary of the focus groups, you want to assure them that individual names will not be used, that they are identification is anonymous. You also in the introduction want to set up a few ground rules, such as you want to hear from everybody, and so everybody should be conscious of limiting their comments and not repeating something that someone else has already said, and then to take turns. So that's the setup for the focus group. The most important part, of course, are the focus group questions. The focus group questions should be short, they should be to the point, they should be conversational, and they should be fairly open-ended. If you're not getting a response to a question, you want to maybe rephrase the question in a little simpler language. And if someone says something that you're not really sure of or want to probe a little more, encourage explanation and clarification. So ask them to say, could you tell us more about that? Or what else were you thinking when you said that? But try to avoid using the word why. When you use the word why, it somehow sets up a more confrontational setup. So why do you think that, right? So you want to avoid using the word why, but you still want to encourage people to explain and clarify what they're saying so that you and your note taker really accurately understand what is being said. The final part of the focus group is the wrap up. One question, and I think we have it on the literacy focus group here, and one question I always ask when I'm conducting focus groups is there any question that I should have asked and didn't? So give them the opportunity to ask additional questions. Again, you want to thank people for participating. They've donated their time to you. Again, reassure them that their comments will be shared anonymously without individual names, and then remind them that everything that was said should be kept confidential. So there are three, basic parts to the focus group: the introduction, the questions themselves, and then the wrap up. And I believe Jennifer emailed to you all of you should have received the script that's been prepared for the literacy focus groups. I'd like you to take a minute or a few minutes to look at that focus group script that you have in front of you and answer these questions. Is anything missing from the introduction? Would you suggest that anything else should be inserted into the introduction? Because what we're thinking is that this is the focus, this is the script that all of you will use when you conduct your focus groups with people who are involved in literacy instruction. So ask your question, is anything missing from the introduction? Are the questions short, concise, conversational, and open-ended? And if they're not, we are open to your suggestions on how the questions could be improved. So we welcome your feedback on that. And then the third piece, of course, is the wrap up or the closing. Take a look at that as well and let us know if you think anything is missing that should be added. So we're going to take about 4 or 5 minutes for you to review that focus group script and answer these questions about the introduction, the questions themselves, and then the wrap up and the closing.
And I'd add my 2 cents here. We're obviously willing to take feedback on the script on email or in a more detailed environment. This training now is to give a scan and understanding of what's there to get your initial reactions. But we're obviously open to exchange or email or any further discussion to finalize things before it goes out.
Thanks, Reno. That's a good point. So this is just an opportunity for you to give your initial reactions. But if you have additional ones after you've had a chance to read it more in depth, we certainly are open to that as well.
Harry, I had a couple questions as I was looking through it that maybe just for implementation might be good to clarify.
Okay.
So on the questions, specifically number 2 to start, it uses site administrators, and then it says, could you tell us about how the site administrator at your school, blah, blah, blah. If they are the site administrator, which I'm assuming is the principal, but maybe that's not what you mean by site administrator. So I need some clarity around the vocabulary, I guess, first.
Right. And Ray, I'll chime in here, but yes.
Yeah, we were thinking that's principals and APs. So basically, if they are principals, about how you and your fellow site administrators establish structures for coaches. How do you create these structures? So there's it doesn't sort of isn't phrased in the clearest way, but that would question be asked of principals, how you and your fellow site administrators do those things. So it was really to be a broad question to be asked of both groups in a similar way. But if that's confusing, we can certainly break it out phrased differently for the leaders versus the teachers.
Yeah, if the coaches, I know it's because the coaches and principals might be in the same group. But I didn't know how to interpret it. And so I was like, I don't know what I should be asking for because maybe I'm interpreting it wrong. But I think my interpretation's fine. It's just how I might word it a little differently. How does your school even establish those things? I don't know. Maybe something to do with number 2. And then number 4, it has that short list of A, B, and C. Are they expected to be asked as separate questions or as one kind of evidence-based, data driven by student data and sufficiently intense? Would we say all of those things at once, or is the expectation we would ask those questions as separate items?
That's a good question. They would be asked separately.
Okay.
So the evidence-based, I think you guys were talking about that before. You have the evidence-based behind it. How do you know that they're evidence-based? How are the decisions of what students get the interventions driven by student data? And then how do you know the rigor has to close the gap? This might be a situation where after you get through A and B, you've already answered C. So that's when you have to be a real active listener. Once they've talked about the evidence-based and the data-driven select choices, they might already have said how they know that they're going to be intense enough. But that's where you have to sort of make an adjustment. But they were all designed to be asked as separate questions to sort of probe on 3 different areas.
Okay, thank you. We can. Okay. Other questions from the group? There's mics kind of randomly around, so feel free to pass it if muted.
I had just something in the purpose statement. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in the purpose statement, in that second paragraph, it talks about, it's voluntary participation. I think it's also nice to add in there, although we would like to hear from all perspectives and all viewpoints, because it kind of sounds like it's okay just to be a silent, and I guess it is okay, but we also want to make sure that people do feel, that, I don't know, a little bit of buy-in that, yes, participate. That's kind of why we asked you here.
Along the
Yeah, we
lines
can
of
make a note there at the end saying but it's important that we do hear from everyone. Something like that.
Just something simple.
Good. Those are good points.
One question I have, and Jennifer, this one. Okay, one question, maybe Jennifer can clarify this too, is we talk in the very beginning about just literacy instruction, and I know our initial focus is K-3. Do we want to specify that, or are we inviting, it doesn't matter what grade level? So it's just elementary, they could be K-6. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because if not, then we may want to clarify that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's not
Excellent.
working.
I do not see the email.
Oh, there he is.
I just noticed that it's in the facilitator instruction or introduction, it talks about recording it. And I'm thinking as a participant, I would like to know that before I entered the room. Could that be included in the invitation? Just kind of let them know that this was going to be recorded and the purpose for recording it. So it's not I think that'd be very uncomfortable to uninvite somebody just because they didn't want to be recorded. And they didn't know that.
I think that's a really,
I would
that's a
like to
really
know
good
that before I entered the room.
Well, I'm wondering if we put in the invitation and then say it again, but like that way
Yes,
they're prepared
yes,
for it.
uh-huh.
Hopefully they read the email.
Yeah, so
Because I felt the same way. I'm like, I don't know if I could do that. I'd be like, oh boy. And so sorry.
Everybody
Yeah, I think including in the invitation would help. Okay.
I think that's
Like
a
that.
good idea.
appreciate your follow-up phone call, Dan. 'Cause
And
just
then I
wanted-
see
didn't want
a
to
question from
surprise
Susan
you
to
and show
everyone.
up unannounced.
She says, will you clarify that I heard correctly regarding your answer to Jennifer? Number 2 is not to be asked of teachers or coaches, only principals.
Number 2 is to be asked of everyone. And it's the idea is how the school establishes structures for coaches and paras to support goals, how the school builds and uses. And when you say the school, my thinking was that the leadership tends to establish those structures. So it's how has leadership at the school or the school itself built structures for coaches to work well. So it's for everybody to talk about the structures at their school. And so maybe we take outside administrators, the question's designed to be answered by everyone. To talk about how you build good structures for good coaching and strong expertise in literacy.
That's what I'm wondering if we just even phrase it almost as you did, which could you tell us about how the leadership in your school has blah, blah, blah. Because then I think they can think of that as coaches or administrators or whoever's doing it. I mean, sometimes they have building leadership teams that are establishing some of this, but it's more about the system, like you're talking about, that's in place. And maybe if we just reword the opening a little bit, because all the questions are for everyone. They have distinction if they have a difference, like number 1 is for teachers, there's a version versus the for coaches. But if they don't say that, they're for everyone. So that helps those of you online with this format.
Thanks, I got that. Thank you, that's very helpful.
Yeah, sorry. I have one other question, maybe in the introduction.
Okay.
I'm just trying to think how to pose the question. So I think when they're talking specifically about like the best practices, which one was it? The monitoring, how do they monitor, and the talking about evidence-based driven, student-driven data. I think a lot of people know the right answers to say versus what they actually do. So I'm not sure if there's something in the beginning, if we say we want to hear what you're doing, not what you wish or would like. That sounds cynical, but I want real feedback from people and not what they think we want them to say.
I'm reading that first line. So to gather feedback and information about how literacy instruction is being provided across the state, maybe if we just beef that up with how literacy instruction is currently being, I don't know, because you want to have like, you want to set the stage of, we want to know what's going on right now,
Right.
not what's optimal, but like current state of affairs. And that help, Miriam, right now? I think it's just helping to reinforce.
It does.
We're not looking for the rose-colored glasses.
You want the real, not the ideal.
Exactly.
And the other question,
That's a perfect saying.
kind of a follow-up to what Sydney just said, is also if principals are mixed in with the actual teachers and instructional coaches from their school, and it may not be a completely positive work environment, are we going to separate? I mean, are we going to have principals from the same school?
I would think
Do you know
you'd
what I'm
want
saying?
different-
If you want honest opinions, you
Yeah.
can't have the leadership sitting there listening to the teachers do that. It actually is.
But like if your coach and principal are in the same group,
Right.
you may not get the exact
Right.
represent. I would,
Right. And you're
for
going to
me,
spend-
inviting, I would say I wouldn't have done that. But maybe some people wouldn't have considered that because they won't be as honest if your supervisor is in the room. Just like they said, don't be the supervisor of these people. I think you also don't want the supervisor in that group because it won't be
Absolutely
as honest of a conversation. I think that's a good point.
Right, and that's part of what we're going to discuss, I think, afterwards, Jennifer, is
Yes, they're going to
how
help
do you
us
go
with
about
who to-
selecting the right people and grouping together. Yeah.
Yeah, I think our recommendation is to have role-alike groups, and that it would be groups of teachers together, and then separately you have groups of coaches together, and then separately you have groups of principals and APs together. That way you don't have that
Right.
role, supervisory role mixed in there or biasing the conversation at all.
Okay, perfect. All right.
But if you do have a role like group of teachers, for example, you might want teachers from several different grade levels in one focus group, just so you hear a variety of opinions. But we'll talk about that more later too, Jennifer. So here's what I've heard so far. It sounds as though we need to rephrase question number 2 to be a little more clear. We also want to make clear that question number 4 is asked as 3 separate questions. In the purpose,
I think now that you have like the A, B, C, to me, now I know all of those. I just needed to know. And maybe the group, you could tell me differently, but as long as now I know if it says A, that's really one item, B is its own, rather than a list, I think that's all I needed. So are you guys okay with that? I don't know if it needs to change at all. I want to save you some work, Mary. It's more just my interpretation, but I think now that we're all on the same page, we would ask it the same way. I was just worried like I might ask it one way and a different group might ask it another, and then you potentially wouldn't get one of those items answered because of the way you asked it. But like you said, you can always rephrase and redirect a little bit too.
and at that end of that paragraph on the purpose, we want to make sure that we say something about wanting to hear from everyone and everybody's opinions are valuable. I also heard people suggest that in the invitation, we say that the focus group discussion will be recorded. So people are aware of that before they even come into the room.
Right, and I'm gonna raise the question that made me go, oh no. 3 groups with the same group. Can you give me more background on that? Because I like a focus group is one time and I get to walk away.
Say that last part again, Jennifer.
In the slides, it mentioned needing to meet with the groups at least 3 times on 3 separate occasions. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe I didn't make that clear enough. So let's say you decide you want to have focus groups with teachers. All that's saying is that you should have at least 3 different focus groups with that.
Oh, it's not the same people. It's 3 like teacher groups of 6 to 10.
Exactly.
Thank you. Exactly. That helps. That makes me feel a little better.
You might want to have.
I just don't think I can get people to keep coming back and doing this for me. They'd be like, once is enough.
Once is enough. Once is absolutely enough. But you do want to hear from at least 3 groups of teachers and 3 groups of administrators and 3 groups of literacy coaches.
Can I back up just a second? When we talk about in the invitation about what it being recorded, I think we should share why it's recorded. Then people will feel more comfortable with it.
That's a good point. Thank you. That's great. Yep, I agree. And then the final thing I heard is that in the introduction, we want to somehow state very clearly that what we want to hear from them is what's actually going on, not what the ideal would be, but what the real is. And so we'll figure out a way to add that into the introduction as well.
Mary, I have a feeling you're a very good focus group facilitator. Very good at rephrasing what we said.
Well, I've done it a fair amount. Thank you. I appreciate that compliment. Thank you. So is there anything else, any other feedback that you have for us? Because now is the time to give feedback. Once we get it out in the field, we're hoping that everybody will pay pretty close attention to the script and follow it pretty closely. So now would be the time to make changes if you think changes are needed.
I just have one on teachers. We ask how long they've taught, and I'm not sure if that sometimes quiets newer teachers down. We don't ask that of administrators or coaches. I'm not sure why it's up there with teachers.
That's a good point. What do you think, Reno?
I mean, we can certainly drop that if folks think that's uncomfortable. I think that it's just asking their name and the content, or they don't want to be content, it would just be grade level, because these are all going to be elementary teachers, right? So right. I think they tell us your name and the grade level you teach.
Yeah.
I think that's a good suggestion. I would suggest in the invitation that you do get a mix of experience levels. You try to do that in the outreach. to make sure you get a mixed pool of folks. You're getting perspectives from folks who've been working on literacy instruction for a long time versus maybe newer teachers, so they can give you different perspectives on maybe the support they're getting or the way things are structured at their school. But that's more of a selection or getting people in the door like we talked about before. You wouldn't really worry about that here. So I think editing that number 1 in that way, it sounds good to me.
Yeah, good suggestion. Any other feedback? Okay, I don't think we put our email addresses right now on the PowerPoint, but Jennifer certainly has our email addresses. So if, as you walk away from the session today, if you think of something that you want to talk to us about, feel free to email us as well. Okay, let's go ahead then and talk about the facilitation, and Reno's going to do that section.
Sure. I think that we had sent sort of a one-page handout, about 12 bullets of just sort of tips for facilitation. I think that's a good reference, sort of a handout for as a refresher to go through. It's sort of tools of the trade. Facilitation is as much art as science, as I think we've alluded to as you go through the conversation with folks. But we've got some main ideas here on the slides, and you can also use the handout. I think the big takeaways are here, and I think you want to make sure, as we've said before, it's a safe, open, and respectful environment where all participants feel comfortable sharing, and sharing honestly. As you said, you don't just want them to give you a stock answer. You want them to have an honest conversation. And generally, I think they do feel that if they are in a role-like group that they're comfortable talking with, if it's not, say, a supervisor in the room, if you can ensure that's a safe, open environment. And you want to keep the conversation moving. You don't want to interrupt folks as they're going. We'll talk a bit if there are people who are taking a lot, dominating the conversation, there are tips around that. But generally, when the group conversation, you're getting different people talking and offering different viewpoints, you want that to continue, and you really want to be an engaged listener to move that along. And I think this goes to the point of the balance part of the conversation. Those who aren't talking, we don't want to discourage those. We want to get those folks to be active, but at the same time, those who are being active, you don't want to completely discourage them. So it's a balancing act, but by being active, listening, and with a couple tips and just massaging the conversation, I think you can really facilitate that in a good way to get, again, to maximize the different perspectives that are in the room. You have people there for 90 minutes, you want to get the maximum you can out of those folks that have dedicated their time. And I think the final point's a very important one also on the slide. It's remaining neutral and being objective. There's really no right answer or agenda, perhaps, in this safe space. You don't want to say, good, that's the right answer, good job. Again, there's no agenda for this. So I think you want to just elicit their perspectives and balance the conversation out. And I think you can do some of that. Go ahead, Mary.
If I could just jump in on that last point, that, for me, it is a real challenge to remain absolutely neutral, because you are going to hear some off-the-wall things. and you just have to say, well, thank you for your feedback. So just keep it in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mary. I know everyone who's on today is an educator and very experienced in sort of literacy, evidence-driven literacy instruction. And I think you guys know the regulations and you know the good best practice, and you'll be in the room hearing about current practice. And if you want honest answers, you might not get the answers that you're expecting. So again, balanced, neutral. The goal is to get those the goal is data collection, and the goal is hearing from the field. It's not training the field in these. That's an important distinction here. Trainings are a completely different paradigm. This is a data collection opportunity, and and neutrality and objectivity are very important. You can continue to elicit further responses by asking people to share an example, or is there more you'd like to say about that? Perhaps you don't say why, like Mary said before, but you say, can you tell me more about that? Give me an example. What do you mean by that? And then if if you're hearing a few of the same responses, you can ask if anyone's had a different experience than that, to give you sort of the contrast and understand, again, the variation that's in the room, if there is some, from different schools, for say teachers in different schools might have a different perspective on the ways that you can deliver positive PLCs to really build teachers' at capacity in literacy, for example. You want to check in on a regular basis throughout the conversation to summarize main points. Usually after a couple, the questions have a couple parts, then maybe at the end of the question, you'll say, okay, what I'm hearing about this is this, and so far we've discussed this, and you want to summarize the main points, much as Mary's been doing from our chat sessions today. And I think finally, we only have 8 or 9 questions, and you think that that's easy to get through, but with 90 minutes, it goes really quickly. So it's important for the script to know what your priority questions are, and you want to put asterisks by those in order to say, I need to answer these 3 questions as we get into it, because you can skip questions if time runs short. This is a key strategy to get into before doing that. We haven't yet done that on the script, and we'd like to take a few minutes to do that now. And to hear what folks think of that. Again, if you look at the focus group questions, question 1 and question 1 is the opening. We're going to keep that one. And question 9, is there anything we've missed? So we'll keep that. But for questions 2 to 8, I'm wondering if you could each prioritize 2 or 3 of those that you'd suggest to be the priority questions. And you can enter those in the chat box, and maybe Mary can track those for us. If you want to take 2 or 3 minutes to scan the questions and suggest your priority questions from the list. And if folks have other questions as well, again, I'm happy to answer and talk through things if folks have other questions. Is anyone there? I think I'm worried that I might have dropped off the call here.
I'm here.
Okay. Are folks entering in the chat box, Mary?
Yes. Would people start entering their priorities? So I see 2, 4, and 6 as priorities. Another one, 2, 5, and 6.
Mm-hmm.
3 and 6. 3, 4, and 6.
So I think we'll be looking at these, and we'll make a list of folks' suggestions, and we'll debrief. I think they're in general areas. I think you can see 6 and 7 are around professional learning for both professional learning for teachers. And then you've got the other areas, sort of monitoring progress, instructional leadership, curriculum, and then interventions for folks with more needs. So those are the areas, and it's I think we'll work through that to get, I said, probably 3 or 4 based on what you guys think are the state's priorities for learning. So we'll see what we get in our discussions with you guys, and we can build that and add those as priority questions. Just a matter of tagging the questions is all.
Right, we'll put an asterisk on them, right? Looks like 2, 3, 4, and 6 are probably our major priorities.
And Sarah and I are checking on number 7. As we are so intimately familiar with the framework at this point. I'm not sure number 7 actually gets at anything that we are desiring at this time. So I don't know if we want to just cut it or if we want to rework it.
I think cutting it, we're gonna, that helps, I think cutting things, because the questions 2 through 6 are pretty rich. There's a lot there. That's going to be a focus of the conversation. So to the extent that we can shorten this, that'd be beneficial. If you think you can get some of this elsewhere, that's beneficial.
Yeah, and what, 5 lends itself to whining? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do we feel like if we went with 2, 3, 4, and 6 and didn't do, and maybe 9 just as a wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Would that be sufficient? I don't know if 7 and 8 really get me a whole lot of critical elements of what we need. Okay, 7 and 8 could go.
Yeah.
And then 5 could be pushed on as needed, but yeah, true. That's true. Okay, so keep 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Priorities are at this point from the list of what people entered would be 2, 3, 4, and 6. 5 if there's time. Yeah. Okay. Just summarizing what I heard, everyone. Rework it.
Yeah.
Which one should we rework?
5A II. So how would you characterize the quality of your current literacy materials? They're concerned that it's going to get too emotionally well, I don't like the stories or things that maybe aren't as valuable as, yeah.
We can take that. I think we can certainly take out that second one, because I think the first one will get at that point. I mean,
I think so too.
And B2 as well.
And then B2.
They talk about PD down below.
That one's for leaders, but I think the other one's for leaders too. Is it not? Oh, maybe we do need it then. I can see where I'm leading.
Yeah, I think we need it. We just need to reword it. I have some feedback on 3 on B. I think the exemplars after it are a little, maybe they don't all fit so well. But if we change the word during your literacy lessons to planning your literacy lessons, because I want to make sure that that's all been thought about before you're actually in the lesson. You've planned for how, what am I going to expect for evidence? Also, this determining which assessments to administer, I'd kind of put at the end rather than in the middle. I think it's just a little disjointed. And I'd like to see something that speaks to the planning, because I see too many teachers just kind of jumping in with materials and not doing all that planning specifically to the kids that are sitting in front of them.
So perhaps maybe it's just changing it to getting rid of the during your literacy lessons. It could just be
planning.
How do you,
yeah,
while teaching literacy, how do you elicit evidence? How do you determine which assessments? Something like, maybe not while, but.
Yeah, but you're not really determining during your lessons.
No. I think if we got rid of the during.
Yeah, the during bothers me, I got to say.
Because some of these things are during and some are before and some are after and some are during. Mm-hmm.
They do.
Yeah.
They do. But they have to be planned for. I don't know. I just think that could be cleaned up a little bit to be more specific to.
Maybe it's even in developing and teaching your literacy lessons or delivering. Yeah.
Or have separate, planning your lesson and then during your lesson.
We'll leave it to you, Raina.
Yeah, we can work that through. Thank you for the feedback. We can rework that question.
And then just for parallel structure, if you'll put put B first and A second, because I think the rest of the document is teachers first and leaders second. And then that one says leaders and coaches, but down below it has teachers and coaches. So maybe those are meant to be different.
Yeah, they were meant to be different. Because this is sort of the oversight sort of teaching. And I don't want to use that term, but quality control is done by both leaders and coaches in many situations.
Okay.
That's a sort of separate aspect of the question.
Okay, and I see 2 points, Reno, that probably see also in the chat box. So 5A, Tammy Goldwater made a suggestion. What are the strengths of your current literacy materials? And then Susan says also that she'd like to add some verbiage in the introduction to facilitate moving on if the discussion turns into elements of slide 6. And slide 6 is what a focus group is not.
Yeah, I think that that's a good portion of a facilitator early on in the introduction saying, I may ask you to move on or may redirect the conversation as needed. As something we have that early on in the script, that will be helpful. So folks know they might get redirected. Which is, I think, is a nice segue. I want to be respectful of time. I do want to, so there's a couple notes here at the end for participants who are challenging. So challenging is an adjective here, not a verb instructing you to challenge participants, but actually describing those participants who are challenging. There might be some who are the self-appointed experts. Many of these folks do know what they're talking about. They all do. But some may feel that they really need to dominate the conversation. And a technique for dealing with that is simply to help thank them for sharing that and ask for some other comments, what other people think. And also ramblers are very similar. They will be talking for 4, 5, 6 minutes, telling a story. You can time it for when they're inhaling, trying to refill their own lung balloons, and you can say it's great that you have so much to share, but if we have time later, we can discuss this more fully. Now we'd like to get back to, and that's a way to redirect. And again, the goal is to get the variety of perspectives that are in the room, including folks who are shy or quiet. And by making eye contact, smiling, or even calling on folks by name, which we note in the tips of the handout, that can help shy participants offer their perspectives. Other folks might not talk very loud. You can ask them to repeat more loudly. And folks are having a side conversation, which often happens if you have folks who work together. If you can ask them to share the discussion with the group, that is helpful. But again, I think we've captured a lot of that on the handout with the tips, but we wanted to get through just those basic. Some of those tips are pretty helpful because also with preserving neutrality, I think sometimes dealing with the conversation and the group dynamics it can be a delicate balance as well.
Could you actually maybe post a few norms?
We didn't. There's a lot. I'd like to direct you guys to these documents. They talk a lot about setting norms in the references. I think it's a good idea if you have time. Sometimes you can just post them and say these are our basic expectations. If you just want to offer them yourself as a leader of the group. If you want to do collaborative norm setting, that's also something you can take a few minutes to do. We haven't talked about that here in this session, but it is part of, there's some structures for doing that in the references. But also, Mary can also offer a perspective on that as well from her experience.
Right. I think the only two that we suggested up front were that you should limit your comments to give other people a chance and take turns. But we could probably come up with a few norms that everybody could use in addition to those two, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think a short list, just because you don't want to take time setting, but it gives it'll be easier for the facilitator to say thank you. Remember? Like, yeah. Okay. Perfect. Any questions that you guys have before? I'm going to sit and talk with them about what we need in terms of invitations and participants and stuff, and then I'll reach out to you all to see who's willing to do what based on your learning today. You might have walked it like my effective filter went up when she said 3 groups or 3 times. I was like, oh God, no one's going to come back for that. I'm going to need money to enlist these people. But now that it's 3 groups per role, I'm like, okay, we can do this. So is there any other effective filter issues that I need to make sure we address? I've got to be honest. Say that again. Yeah.
Just 4 small, limit side conversations, stay engaged, let
Yeah.
everybody talk kind of thing.
Yeah, something simple. It sounds, yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something simple.
Make sure it's like those talking chips. Once your chip is in, you're out. Chips back? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your time today. It is recorded, so I will send a link out. So if you have other people in your agencies that might want to do it, or you're just like, they said something that was important, I did attach the PowerPoint and the handouts to the calendar invite, so you have those there as well. If you can't find it in your emails, calendar invites are always a nice place to go find them. So thank you for coming today. Anybody's not interested in doing this, and maybe email me if you don't want to be engaged further, and then let's not call you out right now. And then we'll move forward on trying to get some of these groups going and before school gets out so that we can
So our
use this data.
timeframe